Hello, and welcome to the Madecast, the official podcast of the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment, a series of lectures on video game history as part of the Made's ongoing effort to preserve history through teaching and displaying playable exhibits of rare games and consoles.
While life in the time of COVID has forced us to close our doors, the support of people like you has allowed us to continue to bring history to you through lectures and interviews like the one you'll hear in a few minutes. I'm Red.
I'm Anthony.
And I'm Miles. This week, Alex chatted with Marie Foulston, curator and creative director of many gaming installations over the years. They talk about some of her favorite projects, her work with institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum, and what she's up to now.
This is another really cool interview. It's interesting to hear what other people who are doing similar things as the Made is do what they do and talk about how they do it. Her installations about like some really unique early controllers seem like a blast to play, and I'd love to get my hands on them. Ha 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 ha. Sorry, I'll keep that to a minimum, but it's a very informative and interesting interview, and I'm glad there are lots of other people out there trying to preserve this amazing history of games that we all love so much. But before we get into that interview, I think it's time for some news. From Software is making a new Armored Core game. I am not too familiar on this little piece of information. Miles, you want to elaborate?
Before FromSoft started making Demon Souls and Souls-likes, they were big into mech games. So, God, what was the funniest one? It was like Steel Wolf or something. You played as the President of the United States. It was incredibly over the top. It was frankly just bizarre, but it was so funny, so stupid. But Armored Core is probably a bit better of their mech games. It's much more sci-fi, and I don't know, they're fun. I like mechs. They're cool. They're big robots.
Mechs are super fun, and I want there to be a lot more. We had an interactive Steel Battalion cabinet that a fan of the museum made, and we had that up and running for a while. It was a hard game to get into, but man, once you get it, it's a really, really fun way to play. I mean, the way he set it up is like you have an old flight seat and you're just in an actual cockpit controlling and having the screens around you watching out the view screen. Mech games are fun. We need more of them. Developers get to it.
So it's not announced yet, but there have been a couple leaks about work that From Software is doing on the 6th Armored Core game. So it's been they've taken a bit of a break from the franchise, and now they're potentially coming back to it, which is exciting to see.
Yes, it is good. It is a good thing to see, to have them branch out and not just focus on the Souls games.
Although maybe they should finish Elden Ring first.
What? Yes. Yes. Like, clearly. But, you know, they can do other things. I mean, Elden Ring seems to be, like, really cool. I mean, I don't know. They were really touting George R.R. Martin as, like, one of the writers initially, and then it kind of just, like, stopped mentioning that. So I'm a little bit worried of, like, they stopped mentioning that right around the time the final season of Game of Thrones came out. They were just like, it's George R.R. Martin.
I don't think that's his fault.
No, it's not his fault. It's HBO's fault for doing all that.
Speaking of HBO.
Oh, yes.
Tangentially related, you'll figure it out when I get there. The Fallout TV show that's being made on Amazon is going into production this year, so it's going to start filming. And it has exciting. A director now. It's going to be directed by Christopher Nolan, who was a writer and producer on HBO's Westworld, which was a very good sci-fi television show.
Christopher Nolan?
Jonathan Nolan. Jonathan Nolan. Jesus.
Okay. I was like, what?
I need to take that again. Yeah.
Okay. No, Jonathan Nolan. Okay.
Jonathan Nolan.
Good. But I mean, so that's still, I think, very fitting. Very fitting. He's familiar with that type of a world. But okay. I was like, Chris Nolan's doing Fallout? Oh my God.
So yeah, Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy, the writers of Westworld from HBO, are tagged to work on the new Fallout Fallout television show that's on Amazon. I have faith in them.
It as long as I wonder if they're going to make a joke character out of Preston Garvey, and then just have him show up at the end of every episode and then be just like, hey, there's another settlement that needs your help. Yes, I mean, we're all excited about the Fallout show, and we'll see what goes on. There's a few other new announcements. PS5 has announced a tournament feature, which will be released this year, so there's still not a lot of information. It was just announced at CES. There's going to be... there's potential for hosting tournaments on your home PS5s, which could potentially put them in the forefront of online gaming and competitive gaming on their console. So that's pretty exciting. GDQ is happening right now this week until the 16th of January, supporting the Prevent Cancer Foundation. Give that a check out if you can, if you're so inclined. Watch a lot of people beat a lot of games really fast. It's really cool. And for charity. It's very good. And then final little bit of info. Monster Hunter Rise is out on PC with mixed reactions. They didn't really do a ton of improvements visually or performance-wise to the game on PC, but we will see what goes on. Still a great game, still super fun, but we'll see what happens in the future. But for now, I think it's time we throw it over to Alex and Marie Foulston. Here's the interview.
And we are here with Marie Foulston. Marie,
hi.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Or say being here. I'm sort of in my kitchen at home. So I guess, well, thanks for being here and being on the computer in my kitchen at home.
Yes, and despite the thousands of miles between us, you're in the UK. And why don't you tell our listeners who you are and what you do and how you got into it?
So my name is Marie Foulston, and I call myself a sort of playful curator. And I guess my background and the work that I do is around about sort of ways in which we can bring video games and sort of digital playful projects and work into public spaces. And that started off predominantly with my work as part of the UK collective called the World Rumpus, which was and still kind of is a ragtag group of folks who were really interested in work that was developing in the independent game scene and alternative game scene, like mostly in the early 2010s, sort of mid 2010s. And we used to throw sort of video game parties and do some sort of exhibitions and installations showcasing that work. And it wasn't at that time that I really thought of myself as being a curator, but on reflection and during that work or through doing that work, that was something that I began to realize that it was right to sort of value that work in that way. And as with, I guess, sort of that famous cliche that if you want to be something, just call yourself it. And so I started calling myself a curator. And that's when museums that are places with proper curators in them with a capital C said, oh, okay, then well, why don't you come and do some work with us? So, and so that sort of work then led to my role at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, working as their curator of video games, which was predominantly being the lead curator on their big video games exhibition from a few years back. But I've also done work with organizations such as Now Play This, which I was guest director for, which is an experimental video game festival in the UK. And I've done a range of installations and projects with a host of different institutions, both big and small internationally.
So let's talk about some of those installations. Can you highlight some of your favorites over the years? Like, what are some of the, I don't know whether we'd say games or performance pieces, or what are some of these things?
Yeah, good question, because you know what, my mind instantly goes towards sort of the work I did at the V&A, and I guess that's because that's some of the most recent. Maybe if I take one from each, I'm trying to think back to World Rumpus and the days that we did that work. That I think, with World Rumpus, one of my favorite works that we showed, and I think it's one of the sort of quintessential games that we were sort of exhibiting from that period, is a game called Raffle Pillar. I don't know if you, Alex, you're familiar with it. But I think I probably need to do a little bit of a pause and explanation for people who are
Absolutely
listening.
explain
I don't
Roffelpiller,
imagine a
please.
lot of people know what Roffelpiller is. So it was a game that was created by a group of designers and developers in Scotland who were based in Scotland at that time called Lucky Frame. And they were really interested in the old Game Track controllers, which I think were originally from a game that was a golf game. And so they probably giving way too much background and exposition.
That's fine. That's what this is for. This is for that background.
I can even tell you about the history of how that controller was invented, which was the guy that invented the Game Track controller was in a hotel room, and he really liked the feeling of pulling the sort of clothesline, retractable clothesline that was in his hotel room in and out. And he thought, oh, this is actually a really interesting way of tracking sort of movement within a sort of, is it not say 4-dimensional space? That's not quite right. 3-dimensional space. Mm-hmm. So before we have sort of like the sort of Xbox and Nintendo that are able to do sort of motion tracking, we have sort of this very sort of, I guess, kind of analog version where it's a retractable string that comes out of a ball socket that moves around in space. Anyway, that's the background on the Game Track controller. But so they were making a range of games and work that was sort of using this controller. And Roffelpiller then was sort of this, I don't even know where they got the idea from because it's so ludicrous, but essentially it's a game where two people lie on their backs and put their heads into this sort of makeshift Wendy house. And on the roof of that Wendy house is a TV screen or a screen, and that shows the game, which is a game in which you are a caterpillar, hence the name Roffelpiller, and you are moving around a space trying to eat apples. And the way that you as the player control your caterpillar within that space is by rolling around in a rainbow, sort of a rainbow sleeping bag. That so you're lying on your back on the floor with your head in a little Wendy house, and attached to that sleeping bag is the string from the Game Track controller, which obviously then tracks your space. And so for me as a project, it's one which I think for me as a work, like I really enjoy people who mine, I guess, older technologies and existing technologies that I don't think we fully explored all of the potential or the creative sort of things that we can do with that work. And so I really love the fact that that was born out of sort of Lucky Frame's desire to just really iterate and work with this sort of older gaming peripheral. But also for me, it's a work which really shows like how there is a value not just in being the person playing that game, but in spectating that game and sort of, okay, this is a game that really needs to be in a public space and being watched by people to really sort of be valued. And the way in which as well that when people are playing games in public spaces, like things like traditional controllers can be really intimidating because there's a whole language established around that controller and what you're supposed to do with it, where if you've got a game that's controlled by sticking your head into a Wendy house and rolling around in a sleeping bag, I don't think there's many people that are going to go into that space and know instinctively how that controller works. So it's like, okay, kind of leveling the playing field here a little bit. So, and it's also just sort of the kind of thing that you want to sort of try out and you want to play. So I think I've probably talked a lot about Roffelpiller, so that I think is one of my favorite projects from when we were doing Wild Rumpus.
Well, that's a great game to talk about. I mean, I cannot think of any other game in the history of the universe where a sleeping bag is the medium in which you play. I mean, yes, the gimbal is the device that's communicating that, but really the interface medium is the sleeping bag. Like you've taken away the controller and it is a bag of fabric that you climb into. Like that's beyond even Nintendo's sort of let's rethink the controller scheme kind of stuff they always do.
Like, yeah, Nintendo, you got as far, and I guess in terms of fabric, they got as far as like the knitting machine, didn't they? And was there something else?
They did a knitting.
Yeah,
they did a
I guess that's not so much the controller.
Yes.
Yeah, but like, where were your sleeping bags, Nintendo? Come on.
Yeah, and those were more for actual fabrication. You couldn't like stick your hand in the knitting machine. That would be bad.
Oh, yeah, that would be bad. Although this has now reminded me of the, I don't remember the name of the project or the name of the developers, which is an awful thing to sort of bring up, but the designers who made the game that runs on a sewing machine, like an embroidering machine.
Yes. I can't remember the names either, but now they've outdone Nintendo, right? Like in terms of these controlling things, I think you've hit on a really cool thing about public display of games. Yeah, the really cool and interesting interfaces are even better when there's a crowd of people watching, especially like, I don't know that this game exists, but like if there was a giant version of QWOP or something. I mean, in your
There
installation,
definitely is a giant version of QWOP. There's Mega QWOP, which was developed by Doug Wilson, sort of iterating on Bennett Foddy's game QWOP, and that was, I think, born from the fact that Doug, as a designer, is somebody who also is really into DDR, and so Mega QWOP is a game where they essentially, like, Doug just brought up, I think, all of these sort of dance mats that were distributed with different DDR games, and stitched them all together and turn them into a giant keyboard. So instead of you having to sort of acrobat or like do sort of like twister with your fingers, you're doing it with your actual like your whole body, which then gave birth to there was Cater's game Alphabet as well, which was tied up to, or that we plugged into sort of a big keyboard controller. So yeah. Mega cool.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, the controllers were displayed, I know, at GDC every year, and you guys did the Wild and Mild Rumpuses at GDC for a few years.
Yeah. That was like we used to do a big sort of party at GDC every year, and then we also inverted or turned the W from Wild Rumpus upside down to make it the Mild Rumpus, which was not the complete opposite of Wild Rumpus, but a desire to be sort of, what's the thing that you really want when you're in a convention center? It's like, hey, here's a space where you can just sit down and stare at a screen for a bit and just switch your head off for a tiny moment, or charge your phone and have a nap. It's fine. And look at these sort of calming games.
Yeah, it was very nice. So tell us about the V&A exhibit.
Yeah, so like I went from this sort of one end of the spectrum where I was running events with friends. We were doing it on sort of a shoestring budget, holding things together with sort of gaffer tape and crossed fingers and like unlimited bags full of USB dongles. And then you go to the entire other end of the spectrum to working within a large established cultural institution like the V&A, like one of the biggest sort of museums in the UK and probably internationally as well. And suddenly working within a historically established institution with so many sort of processes and regulations and ways of sort of ensuring like the integrity of the work that you're developing, and obviously working with a much bigger budget as well. And so that work was kind of not the exact opposite of what I was doing with Wild Rumpus, but whereas with Wild Rumpus, like a lot of our curatorial focus was around works which we knew would work well within public spaces. When you're undertaking an exhibition for an institution like the V&A, in the scope of that exhibition, we couldn't just limit ourselves to just looking at games that worked well in public places in terms of being played. It was like, okay, well, what about a range of games which, and the whole range of works which aren't intended to work in these spaces, which actually wouldn't work well in public areas? So, yeah, so it was this huge sort of, huge learning curve for myself, but an amazing opportunity. And I can obviously talk about sort of the scope and focus of that exhibition as well, and the thesis.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I'm not sure everybody here got the chance to see it.
Yeah, so the thesis of the exhibition was one which, and to sort of put the background to it as well, that the exhibition was called Video Games Design, Play, Disrupt, and it was very much not the first major exhibition about video games in a large cultural institution. That there's the history of the Game On exhibition from the Barbican, Game Masters from Acme, the Art of the Video Game from the Smithsonian. And so there's this whole sort of legacy and history of exhibitions which had really pioneered about bringing video games into large cultural institutions. And what we wanted to do with this exhibition was to really not copy that work, but to build upon it. And I think for me, one of the key things that I wanted to really push with the exhibition, and the V&A did as well, was firstly was to establish an exhibition that was not looking back as a historical retrospective. And I think up until that point, that's sort of the way that a lot of video game exhibitions felt that they had to do. It's like, okay, well, we're introducing this to an audience within these spaces, so we've kind of got to tell the whole history of the medium from here to here, and here's the modern day. But we know that there's, and as I'm sure many people do, that there's so many more detailed and nuanced stories about video games that can be told through the present day. So the focus for the exhibition was very much on, at the time, and I guess for a little bit longer, sort of contemporary games. And this specific thesis was sort of saying, okay, in the mid 2000s, there was this whole host of sort of technological catalysts from smartphones, broadband, social media that sort of had this radical impact on the way that games are designed, the way that they were sort of distributed, and the way that people play them. And so every game that we featured within that exhibition was a work which we felt was almost sort of disrupting and pushing back against a lot of our expectations about what video games are and what they can be. And it was an exhibition that was also the other way that it sort of was seeking to sort of define itself, I guess, against a lot of exhibitions that have gone previously, was that, as I sort of mentioned, like a lot of the games that we exhibited are games which, perhaps aren't going to work so well in an exhibition context. So take a game like Bloodborne, which was one of the titles that we showed in that exhibition. It's just sort of, okay, that will work for some people, but this is a game that's sort of going to take sort of upwards of 60 hours maybe for sort of any one player to really understand it as a design object. And you probably need to be in a certain space and in a certain context to play that game. And equally, if you're somebody who's not familiar with games, or even if you are, this is a brutally difficult game. So how would us exhibiting that game in a playable format in an exhibition actually help you as a visitor to understand that work? And so another key part of the exhibition was that, yes, there were interactive games and things that you could play with throughout the exhibition, but the majority of work that was on display actually wasn't things that you could interact with. It was very much sort of a challenge that we had about how do we take video games and have a way of displaying them and develop ways of displaying them that communicate something that we as curators really want to convey to an audience. And how do you do that sometimes if interaction and direct sort of play is not necessarily the best way of doing that? And I think that sort of work kind of brings me to where my sort of practice and my thinking is at the moment, which is really that I am really interested in sort of that challenge of, well, how do you display those games and how do you find a way of translating those stories? And I think for me, it's a critical part of that work. And I think it spans through all of this, is understanding that for me, sort of exhibiting video games and the way that we need to think about that work is to think about video games through the lens of performance. And that could be that, yes, we want to enable the performance in a public space, but maybe we also want to convey and communicate a specific performance to you rather than have you participate in that. And so that's kind of where my work is today, is thinking about weird and different ways to exhibit games that sometimes might be playing them, but sometimes might not as well.
Yeah, I think it's all about the context of what you're trying to communicate, right? Yeah, exactly. So speaking of which, what are you working on now?
So I say I'm working on a project which isn't publicly announced, which is for me sort of a development of my practice as sort of an independent curator and working sort of in that more sort of DIY capacity and trying to build on the best parts of that, unite the best parts of the work that we could do within that space, and also that rigor and practice that you have within sort of larger institutions of finding a way, okay, well, what is the middle ground here? How do we pull the best parts of both of these spaces? But for me, also thinking like, I don't think yet that we have fully worked out the best way of creating cultural spaces that allow us to explore and engage with digital works, especially digital works that sort of that are interactive, that reveal themselves over a period of time. And so, and for me, that work's led me to a place of thinking about how we can create sort of this hybrid sort of performance-based concept for exhibiting games, and specifically with the work I'm doing at the moment, looking at sort of virtual worlds and understanding virtual worlds through this sort of lens of thinking of them as being sort of sites of heritage as well. So that's one project. And I guess if there's an example or something that connects to that that's more tangible and less sort of like confusing as I've probably outlined it, that a lot of this work for me was really inspired by sort of projects that we undertook at the Now Play This festival back in 2020, which was, as with a lot of festivals, one which we had to transition from being an in-person festival to being online. And we really wanted to create experiences as part of that. We really sort of created this sort of embodied experience of being with other people in sort of a physical space. And so as part of that, we undertook a series of guided tours around different locations. So one was Robert Yang took people through the Black Mesa Research Facility in a multiplayer version of Half-Life. And we had Gareth Damian Martin take people through No Man's Sky to undertake a virtual landscape photography workshop. And it was just really, so a lot of the work is really building on what happens when you treat games in that way, when you allow people to embody those spaces with that sort of mindset. So that's one side of the work that I'm on, but something that I can talk about a bit more publicly is a short film called The Grannies, which was also a project that came out of Now Play This last year, which is a short experimental documentary that tells the story of a group of players who broke out of bounds from the video game Red Dead Online. And it's a short film that sort of talks about their experiences with sort of what it means to explore beyond the spaces within a video game that you're supposed to inhabit. And what happens, what do you find beyond those boundaries? But how does that also help convey and communicate something about the materiality and the fabric and the humanity of video games and virtual worlds? So that film at the moment is screening at a few festivals internationally. So it's just been premiered at the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam. And it's just been announced that it's going to be part of London Short Film Festival in January. And we hope that it will be part of a few other festivals internationally, although several programs haven't been announced yet, so we can't talk about that. But yeah.
Oh, lovely. That's wonderful. We'll definitely have to make sure we catch that. That's interesting, the exploring the outside of the boundaries. I mean, how far it's come from the world beyond walls of the Castlevania Symphony of the Night crew.
Yeah. Anybody that sort of transgresses what you're supposed to do in spaces, in video games, like the old sort of, what was the old game show the talk show that used to take place in Halo? Was it Red versus Blue?
Red versus Blue. Yeah.
And sort of projects such as that, where it's just like, I mean, maybe there is this sort of, someone was saying on Twitter the other day, like, is there some sort of renaissance happening or revival happening within machinima? And they might be right, actually. When you look at the programming for a lot of film festivals now, there's a lot of work within video games happening there, which is really fantastic to see.
Interesting. Yeah, the machinima, there's a word I haven't heard in a few years. Well, Marie, thank you so much for being here. It is lovely to talk to you, and we hope we can finally get you over here to the U.S. to show you all the stuff on the West Coast.
I would love to. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for being here, and take care.
And we're back. Okay, so thank you once again, Mary, for chatting with Alex and joining us on our podcast. We hope to hear more about any projects in the future, potentially maybe a collaboration if things open up and we have a space again. So that'll be very nice to see again. I would also like to make a question to you guys. What have you been playing before we end this episode? Anything fun? Anything new?
I picked up Celeste.
Oh, yeah?
Over the weeks. I felt like playing sort of a retro platformer. It's really fun. I like the mechanics. They present them to you in a sort of linear fashion in order of difficulty. So they'll present one mechanic here, like, oh, you can go through this and this does this to you, and then they just kind of get really creative with it and really force you to think of your series of events. Reminds me of sort of those hardcore platformers like Boshi, or some of those other like sort of seemingly impossible, but it's not too hard. It's a little easy. But I do believe there's like a sort of end game where they do up the difficulty on those really hard sort of platformers. But I'm enjoying it.
That's
good.
good.
Really cool.
I've been looking at Celeste, and I've been terrified of getting started with it because of how difficult I've heard the platforming is. Like, maybe I'm just a wimp and not good at gaming, but it's
okay. I have never touched it, but everyone at the museum is a big fan of it, and they highly recommend it. One, for the story, for the visual, like, just the art design and the story, and yeah, it's also just a really fun game from what they hear. Difficult, yes, but you can also make it. You don't need to be the perfect gamer and play everything on the hardest difficulty. You can just play, normal or easy, or kind of hard, if that's an option. There needs to be more realistic descriptions of what the hard modes are on those games too. It's just it's easy. It's oh, little baby, oh, just here for the story, oh, and then normal is just it's a game, kind of hard sometimes, kind of not sometimes. Have fun. Hard, it's instant regret. Only for the true challengers. I don't know, anything to entice people to check out all these different sides of the games, but. Yeah, I've downloaded a few games. I think I mentioned this last week, but I got Figment on my Switch at a killer deal. I also got Hyper Light Drifter on the Switch, which I'm yet to start. That was on a good deal on Switch, so I'm excited to get that. I played a bit on my friend's PC when it was initially coming out. Very fun game, but in the meantime, I've also have Undertale Chapter 1 and 2 to play. I'm currently playing Monster Hunter Rise, but I need to find more people to play with because solo is fun, but not as fun as when you're hunting in a group. And then Horizon Zero Dawn is still in the process. Still amazing, still beautiful. The story's right up my alley, but it also takes a long time. It's not as many games that you can just pick up for a half-hour setting and then leave alone after.
Yeah.
But that's also why Hades is the perfect game, because you can just go in for 30 minutes and then be done.
Do one run and walk away, yeah.
Yeah. But it is what it is. There's a lot more games coming out this year that I'm very excited to talk about, and we will see what goes on. But before then, I think it's time we wrap it up today. So we want to thank you for listening to the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment's official podcast. If you have any thoughts, questions, corrections, or general museum ideas, please shoot us an email at info@themade.org.
We'd like to send a big thank you to everyone who donated recently and to our Patreon supporters who keep the Made afloat. Patreon donors get to listen to this podcast 1 week before it's released on major streaming services, and we'll continue that with future episodes every week.
This week's episode was brought to you in part by Patreon donors NoClip and Eric Fong. Thank you so much for your support. Until next time, I'm Miles.
I'm Anthony.
And I'm Red. Thanks, and we will see you next week. Later, gamers!